So here with us, we have a Payal Arora, and she is a digital anthropologist and the author of award-winning books, including the recent The Next Billion Users and the TEDx speaker. Her expertise lies in digital experiences and user values among low-income communities worldwide, and comes with more than a decade of fieldwork experience in such context. She was also Forbes named her as a next billion champion, and she is a kind of right person for a reform of tech. So probably, as you already just got introduction, so if you need any guidance or a coaching to disrupt any of the tech, to whom you should reach out to. At the same time, she is celebrity among several international media like BBC, Economics, etc. She is also a travel addict, having a good, and she has given a lot of presentations, almost 200 plus presentations in 109 cities and 54 countries. This is fascinating. And I'm lucky to have you, Payal. It's all yours.
Thank you, Prashant, and appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Let me just share the screen. All right. Yeah, thanks, everyone. So this is really wonderful to be here. I know it's really late out there, so I'm going to try to wake you up. So, I was listening to the previous presentation, and I really think this is wonderful because I really resonate with a number of points from the previous presentation. So let me just get started, and you'll see the ties here, right? So indeed, I authored this book, The Next Billion Users, last year, and I am a digital anthropologist, and usually the next question is, what the hell is that, right? And so basically, that's just a fancy way of saying that I look at and study how people make sense of everyday digital media in their everyday lives, right? So what do they think about it? How do they use it? And for over a decade, I've spent the time in low-income communities, starting with India, actually, my first care was in Kuppam, and then after that was in Almora, so a number of parts in India, and then it scaled to Brazil, Nigeria, more recently, Rwanda is emerging. So, quite a diversity of sites, right? And particularly low-income populations. So what's really interesting, right, is since about a year, this book has sort of gained a lot of traction, and it's not a coincidence because I've been doing what I've been doing for more than a decade. So why now? Why is it this new hot thing about the next billion user market? You have even the term, the NBU market has become something of a thing, right? Google and Spotify, a number of these institutions and organizations have set up their own little NBU research wings. And what's fascinating in the last year alone, I've been talking to such a diversity of organizations. These are just a sample, like more than 40 to 50 from consulting to giving talks. And the common denominator here is the next billion user market. So if you look at Process, for example, they're one of the biggest technology investment companies. So they invest in emerging tech, right? And what's really interesting is they have changed their whole business model in terms of they're not just remote investors, they're very much hands-on. They want to be partaking in design. So, this is very much resonant from the prior presentation about the sort of blurring of professionalisms, right? That designers are in one box, technologists are in another box. Here you have investors who are saying, hang on, this is my business too. I have some ideas, right? So you have Process, you have Liberty Latin America Telecom, which has dominated the Latin American market for a long time, particularly the low-income segment. And they wake up with the unusual sort of case of, yes, they're cash heavy and they're pretty secure, but they seem to be doing some real cost-intensive investment in these societies. And the way they look at it is their pie is being stolen by all these apps that are feeding off all their heavy investment. And I can go into Spotify that has just set up their next billion user lab, and they're finding that it's not enough to just translate an app, into the indigenous language and then say, look, this is at last adopted to the local context, right? It just doesn't work in context, particularly as complex as India. And, something like solar, like the North Solar, where you have these new business models that are emerging, which are packaging the most interesting assortment of services. And you're going to see this much more so, right? Especially during the COVID times, because you need to do a lot of value addedness. So what is solar? North Solar is basically they're selling solar panels, but for them to get Rwanda's MOU through, they had to also package it with partnering with app developers and designers and all kinds of, they need to provide so much more as a package deal because they're dealing with a newbie public, which is new on many fronts, from fintech to solar panels. So how do you, inculturate that kind of new user group, right? So indeed, these conversations are really fascinating, and but it helps for us to sort of anchor by asking us something really basic. Who are these next billion users, right? So just on a more basic level, they are, for a good part of them are young, something like 35% to 40%. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, it can go as high as 60% to 65%, right? So, and a majority of them live outside the West. So in fact, you even see the birth decline in places in Europe, and you see a huge uptake in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And you're talking about 85% of the population is residing, especially young people who are very much adept and embracing mobile technologies, right? And there are far more male than female. In fact, a disturbing trend of women's adoption and sustenance on these apps are declining actually in the last year or so. And we can talk more about that later, right? So this is a sort of a demographic. Now, obviously, this is, this wake-up call is not a coincidence about the next billion users, because just by the sheer number, we're talking about they are disproportionately from the low-income segment, right? So by sheer number, they are just a data gold mine, right? That's such an obvious, so they are the new oil. And so of course, every company wants to really tap into that, right? So this is really what we're talking about is a sort of the fuel for the data economy. And if you look at it in terms of the AI economy, they're talking about how this is also really the way in which you can get a leg up in terms of AI growth, right? So very clearly, nobody's arguing that the NBU should be at the center of UX now. We need to start thinking about it. In fact, that's one of the most powerful ways of disrupting your business model. Because look, you need to think out of the box. And if this is an untapped market, then of course, on multiple fronts, you need to go for it, right? But the question is, there still remains a huge dearth of information. Like, we are really lacking. It's like a black hole of information of what's going on there. We don't know much about it. And the kind of information we already have is deeply colored by certain stereotypes, right? So I'd like to just talk about 3 myths, because look, we are in a very unusual time. We all know this. I mean, don't bring up the C word, right? It's like COVID is like pretty much infused our whole imagination. And it is tempting to become risk averse because, this whole let's go back to business as usual. Let's go back to normal, right? There's this yearning for normalcy. And that's not going to work, as we know that, right? Because these are extremely disruptive forces at multiple ends, and it is a global phenomenon. So how do you assess risk? How do you take on risk? And so people are justifiably, could be arguing that, well, sure, the next billion user market would have been a great focus, last year or pre-COVID, but now things are different. We can't afford to experiment. And I'm arguing it's the reverse. Actually, you cannot afford not to experiment because look, everybody, there's a huge rush towards the usual suspects. this is the untapped market. And if you really want to stay ahead in the game, especially in these times, you need to look at them as the core market and central to your redesign, right? And the other sort of aspect I would like to say to designers is that, you know, you're not just designing a product, you're designing a social institution. Now, that is something I would like to really emphasize. You're building a political sphere, you're building an educational sphere, you know, so like programmers can actually, it's like building up a school, like with a brick and mortar. Okay, how do you want this building to look like? But you're building the ethos of what education looks like, the underlying paradigm, right? The relationship between the teacher and the students and the administrators, that is encoded into design. And so you're literally building relationships and institutional buildings. So it is really a sort of it's an honor to be profiled in that position and an enormous responsibility, which means to mitigate the risk, you need to first address the 3 myths, right? Just for the sake of, you know, for this presentation, I've sort of like just plucked out 3 different myths that we tend to fall in love with or tend to hold on to a bit more than others. And the one is, and the myth is that of the rational user, right? Now, in a decade of my research, you know, I started off in Kupam, as you can see, with Hewlett Packard and this small project where they were like, we're going to bring, you know, information to the doorstep of all people. And this was years ago, right? And the idea, this was when Chandrababu Naidu was, you know, the CEO of Andhra Pradesh, so quite a while ago. But the idea was it's going to become this community. We're going to have a NASDAQ information 24/7. You know, people are just going to be completely transformed. And, you know, one of the biggest the ways in which people got on board and got into the internet and got into computers was through entertainment. We would have movie vans, right, which would go into different villages. And that's why they came, not because of how farmers could like be competitive with crop pricing, or women could learn about healthcare information. All that was fluff. They wanted to watch the good old Telugu movies, or kids wanted a game on this ATM of information. So it was fascinating. It was a hook, right? And I've been sort of harping on this about how we need to stop being so cautious and we need to talk about the leisure that people amongst low-income communities want to experience. And somehow people feel very uncomfortable about that because they feel you can't be, you know, we're talking about a serious subject. Poverty is serious business. You can't trivialize it with leisure. And in fact, if anything, if people are poor, of course, they're going to be much more rational about how they use their very limited data plans. And on the contrary, it's not the case, because in fact, it's an essential coping mechanism. And today we have the data to prove it. We know that the majority of what people do are very leisure oriented, very social. A lot of the data is diverted towards in pornography, you know, social networking sites, gaming sites, you know. So it's really, of course, entertainment, right? I mean, Geo itself, look at their advertising byline, the ABCD principle, right? How do they sell it? Is because they understood, based on the data itself, that the average Indian user, particularly of the low income segment, needs 4 things. And that would be a big hook, right? As ABCD, astronomy, Bollywood, you know, cricket, and devotion, right? And that has been my data for more than a decade. So it's only now, if we had listened to the thick data from the field, we would have been on top of this, you know, a decade earlier. Imagine that, right? So what I'm arguing here is we need to put the ludic, which is play, into the ludicrous design. It may seem unreasonable and ludicrous and irrational if we have a particular stereotype of vision of this user as very rational, but it would make complete sense if we understand that they're very human, and in a sense, they require, it's an essential coping mechanism, and they need to be immersed in these kinds of platforms, right? So the second myth, right, is that they're a stable user. Now, the stable user is sort of a misnomer because, this is a sort of an import from, a typical stable, like incomes of, you have a monthly paycheck, for example. You live with a family in a family home. You actually have a home, you have an address, right? So these things are so obvious that you don't even think about it. So when Spotify is coming into India, right? They have a family plan as a way to sort of attract different family members, and a postpaid to, give it a sort of a recurrence, right? So this is very important. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense if you start to look at the realities on the ground level. Majority of the NBU segment live paycheck to paycheck on an everyday level, right? So they don't have a monthly income. They often don't have savings. They have payments. The payment options need to be made a day at a time. Secondly, their families don't look like a cliche family that we have envisioned. In fact, mass migration, we're talking about millions, Filipinos, nurses moving to Canada, leaving their families behind, right, for the grandparents to take care. Bangladeshi construction workers moving to Dubai, millions of them, so they can send back home. In fact, the NBU economy is a remittances economy. And this is a kind of typical picture you can see about a family, which is 6 to 8 young men, whether it's in in a small town in China to Dubai, sharing a room, right? And that's the family for a year or so, or many more years, right? So that's something that we need to disrupt in terms of the stability of a user. So what I'm really asking here is that we need to think in terms of flexible design, right? Because you can't have a frozen design and then flirt around the edges of change. The design needs to be intrinsically flexible so you can create and add value and allow and co-create, right? Which means that you need to be able to work with the segment, because the fact is that you're not going to understand the segment, and you never will, because they're not a frozen entity, right? So they are going to change because their circumstances are going to change, their contexts are going to change. So we need to be able to allow them the engagement, as the prior speaker talked about, like become more of a producer, creator, but not just in terms of content, in terms of design, right? For them, for you and them to have a good dynamic. And so that actually is another way of reducing the risk when you're dealing with the NBU market. And the last myth is about this cultural user, right? And I hear this really often. It's our Indian culture, it's the Brazilian culture, it's an African culture. And I understand, we do understand why people like to state that, because you feel that you need to have a sense of belonging, because there's no such thing as an indiscriminate public, right? We don't just want to be anybody and belong to the world. We want to feel special, so we want to be part of a specific group of communities. But the choice should be from the user end, not from that imposed upon. And unfortunately, we are riding on certain cultural tropes, whether on a nationalistic end that, oh, Indians would behave this way. Now, if you look at the consumption of music, right, say Spotify or music in India, hip hop and K-pop is consumed by a lot of these people. I have a lot of low-income communities, especially even young girls and boys, able to lip sync on TikTok Justin Bieber, right? And so K-pop is actually a very dominant genre. This is completely not Indian, right? So it sort of defies that. But we are global aspirational beings. And that's very intrinsic of the NBO market, is they're even more aspirational and they want to be part of this global citizenship, right? And so another aspect of the cultural user is that, for example, there's a gendered aspect, because we feel that we've been fed into, fed with certain kind of cultural tropes of, well, the the farming community, for example. There's a certain culture. It's obviously masculine, right? The typical farmer, you have a picture of a male, and farmer suicides and males being at a loss on how to provide for the family. Now, if you look at the stats, more than 70% of the agricultural community in many African countries are women dominated. Construction work in India is also a substantive number of them, are millions of them are women, right? So a lot, and farming communities, including the one I was a part of in Almora, completely dominated by women, more than 95%, because these are subsistence versus, commercial farming. But we don't differentiate it. And why does that matter? Is because we need to understand that what we have today is, and what we need today in this rush towards, automation and AI and optimizing the potential of AI, is that we need to think in terms of deep design, right? What does that mean? It means deep learning, which is machine thinking, where it depends on how you label data, and that kind of labeling will be reproduced based on typical state categories that we will be importing into the system. And design thinking, which basically says you can't just cater to one aspect. You need to see the ecosystem within which that entity is, right? So deep design is basically bringing the two together to make sense, so again you can reduce the risk. So for the sake of time, I would like to end with just in terms of leadership, right? We have these sort of cliches of don't be evil from Google. I would argue we need to talk about don't be good. And I know I'm kind of trolling here, but what I mean by this is that I am so sick and tired of hearing about AI for good initiatives. What does good mean? Because it's very dangerous when you look at tech companies telling and sort of convincing designers they're doing good by designing this app for empowerment, right? Because when you have this like AI for good mantra, then what happens is that you start to become condescending to your users. You start to keep thinking about it as an altruistic act. No, they are very much consumers. They're paying with their data, which you need, right? And platforms definitely need. And they're paying with their time, they're paying with their privacy, they're trading off a lot, right? So we cannot go into this AI for good down the line. Other is Facebook, right? Move fast and break things. We need to understand it's of course that has been critiqued a lot about its disruption, but we should replace it with move slow and build things, because the fact is when people said, oh my God, Facebook has betrayed us and betrayed our trust, we're going to leave it. Well, people didn't leave it, not because they love Facebook necessarily, but because it has become more than just an app. It's become a public sphere. And I said at the beginning, you're building institutions, particularly in majority of the global South countries, which have weaker institutions. And so people are seeking for alternative platforms which can allow for new kind of politics and new kind of commerce. So you're building things, and start to think about why Libra failed, right? Because they didn't have a sort of a trust economy, and they moved too fast, right? With sheer hubris. And then Apple, right? About think different to, I would say, think difference, because we need to account that if we realize that 70% of the typical prototype user is traditionally white male, and if you look at different industries, not just like say tech, it's across different industries, particularly from the West, these ideas get imported and then you sort of tweak it, right? Whether it is testing driverless cars, look at the kind of dummies that are used, right? In terms of height, whether it's male or female, body type, etc. So the problem is it's not about diversity for diversity's sake, it's diversity because it makes the most sense. So I'm going to just stop here because I think it will be more interesting. I saw so many interesting questions from people. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can continue.
And wonderful pile so far in terms of what you shared. in terms of what are the different myths that you talked about. Wonderful in terms of, even the different acronyms that you usually, you shared about it: A, B, C, D, astronomy, Bollywood, cricket, and devotion. That's what Geo focused on. At the same time, coined one other one, NBU, a next billion user. So fascinating in terms of understanding, learning a lot of things from you. So one of the other interesting question that I see that the list is one of the, when you say design should be personalized, how can one design the same thing, that design, which will usually work for the billions as well? How can we design that, that kind of solution which works for billions?
Well, I mean, that's actually an interesting point. So, people, this ties to why digital anthropology, right? Because I'm a big advocate for this, because the thick data, in some sense, the typical argument of, oh, a small study, which is
Mm-hmm.
data, deep,
Okay.
is not enough to give me the confidence as a decision maker, whether I'm a designer or not, to design in a particular way. I need
Mm-hmm.
the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know now that big data is deeply flawed because it has really, like, whether it's Twitter data, right? It's barely representational of the general public. It's mainly white male of a high economic standpoint. So we already have a lot of the data of the gaps and also very misleading aspects of big data. However, we haven't focused on, it's not either or, as the prior presenter brought up, it's and, right? So it's thick data in conjunction with big data. And the interesting thing about thick data is that it reveals that if you understand the motives, like the reasoning behind a tiny small group of community people who are in a particular positioning, right? Low income, precarity, everyday wage laborers, that can be scaled and resonated across different cultures. It cuts through, just like, an upper class Indian will have a lot more in common maybe with someone in the US than maybe with their servants, right? Like, so that is what I'm talking about, is that there's a scalability in nuance, but there's less of a scalability in the flattening of understanding.
Just to add one thing that kind of shows up on the poll, and Payal couldn't resist but jump in. I don't know if you're able to see the results of the poll
Mm-hmm.
and what they feel about this term user research.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Turns out that a vast majority of them agree that you cannot create a wow if you really ask the users what they want, right? And so, how do you now apply the field of anthropology and psychology in kind of figuring out what even users don't know themselves? What's your special tip for folks to create that wow factor using user research? Is that even possible?
Yeah, so it's really, I think this is very much. I was listening to the presenter before, right, and he talked about the want, and he said, "Don't ask them what they want," because the Ford example, and I actually disagree, because you have to ask them what they want. It's too condescending to assume, right? I mean, if you're in a relationship, do you want to keep guessing what's in the mind of your wife or husband? It helps. The first step in communication is just ask, what do you want, right? Now, that the question is, you don't stop there. As a designer, you're a translator of the want. So your job as a wow is not, the user is not going to deliver it on a platter, right? And so you're asking them the wrong questions about what do you want in terms of, yes, you're not listening keenly, right? Because you have to also observe. You're not listening just in terms of what they're saying. You need to observe the context within which they're saying it. You go and ask a woman surrounded by her family members saying, what do you want? Are you happy serving your mother-in-law? And she's like, of course, I love it. Handing over my mobile phone to my brother so he can play video games while I clean up his room. So sure, you're not going to learn much. So, it's where you ask, what do you want? How you ask it. On TikTok, they are constantly these sort of, hashtags itself is a signal of what people want, right? We're just not listening in the right way. That's the thing. And also, by the way, here's another sort of devil's advocate. You don't need to wow. The wow factor is why you're not being able to compete, because that's because we are thinking in terms of deep resources. The Apple can wow, but how did China rise? They rose because they decided of a good enough technologies. That's how they broke into a market, because they came up with good enough technologies for segments of population which were constantly ignored by the wow, because they're like, yeah, they don't even have the aesthetic, they don't have this. They're not going to cater to the majority of the world's population because we can't figure out what can wow them, right? And that's why China has managed to win over India.
It's very interesting. So in your view, and obviously it's a big debate that would take its own time, and today may not be a good one. But just to summarize, what you're saying is, don't necessarily go for wow. There's another option of delighting the customer without the wow.
Yeah, like I'll give you an instance, right? So I in one of my fieldwork, we were trying to come up with a corpus of like songs. This was one of the first projects I'd done in Kuppam. And you're competing with Tollywood songs, which are professionalized, etc. And we were trying to create a corpus of folk songs. Okay, so this was a way we wanted it because the government said you can't establish this project unless you do something good. So like, sure, okay. And we did it, and it was mediocre because we don't have a deep budget, and it was a CSR initiative. But the uptake was really, really high because there was few people professionalizing their folk songs. At that time, Gadar was going around, singing his lungs out, and he was super popular. And, so we released a mediocre product out there, and it was consumed as if it was candy. So I actually believe that if you get into a market and even you give something where there's nothing, right? I'm not saying that you have to dumb it down. I mean, the idea is you need to think, because it is becoming a competitive space. As I brought up, many of these companies are already looking at the NBU market. So my question is not whether you should or shouldn't look at it. My question is, how can you compete with deep pockets, right? Like Spotify and like Facebook.
So, yeah. Speaking of deep, speaking of deep pockets, not just going to lose that train of thought. If you look at the second question, and it looks like about a third of them who did select an answer, and of course, this was a question I think was purposely created around myths. But if you look at a third of them, they're saying, "Hey, look, it's too expensive for startups to actually do user research, and perhaps not practical." What's your quick response to that in interest of time?
Well, you don't need to do it. You need to collaborate. You need to partner, right? And this is where there's a lot of people doing this kind of research. Yeah, and so I think partner with academia, for example, right? And academics need to transform their mindset. The younger academics are very geared towards industry. So we need to come up with a public-private partnership, especially smaller firms, right? So it doesn't have to, and like I said, the thick data is actually far less costly than big data in terms of data scraping and mining. So yeah.
Fascinating. Super. Well, looks like that's all about the time that we have. While that happens, a big thank you, and we could put up the virtual badge. Thanks a lot, Payal, for spending the time, and truly appreciate.
I know it's really late for you guys, so thank you.
No, this is fascinating. At this late and with this many sessions, I think we still have about 300 people, listening and tuned in. So obviously, your magic is holding all us up.
I'm surprised people haven't got the Zoom fatigue. It's gonna become a right?
Yeah, I think
version maybe.
very, very insightful. Thanks a lot for
Thank you so much.
spending the time.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.